A homeless veteran was beaten on a quiet Friday night, not for what he'd done, but for daring to exist where he wasn't supposed to. Behind that cruelty stood Leonard Briggs, a polished official who called people like Danny Rhodes a visual blight. But fate had its own way of fighting back. One viral video, 500 roaring engines, and a community forced to face its conscience. And when the thunder finally rolled through Clearbrook, justice woke up for good. The night wind carried the smell of rain and fried food through Main Street, the kind of small-town Friday where neon reflected off wet pavement and laughter spilled out of every doorway. Inside Cole's Tap, the regulars had settled into their usual rhythm. Football on the screen, beer mugs clinking, the same jokes recycled with louder voices. Nobody noticed the man outside at first. Daniel "Danny" Rhodes moved carefully along the sidewalk, a duffel strap digging into his shoulder, his posture giving away the weight of more than just what he carried. The cardboard sign tucked under his arm read, "Marine, hungry, not hopeless." The words weren't a plea, they were a quiet boundary, a way to hold on to dignity in a town that had forgotten the difference between needing help and asking for pity. He wasn't begging, he was surviving the night wind and the long walk between places that still tolerated him. Across the street, Mia Walker was locking up her cafe, wiping her hands on a towel when she saw him pause near the bar's side door. She had seen Danny before, the man who picked up litter before dawn, who nodded when thanked, who fixed a kid's dropped bike chain without saying a word. To most, he was part of the background. To Mia, he was a reminder that kindness could live in quiet places. Inside the bar, Travis Cole was nursing his own storm. Once the town's high school football star, he'd turned his father's tavern into a refuge for the discontent. But lately, he'd been under pressure. The Harvest Festival was coming, the biggest event of the year, and the mayor pro tem, Leonard Briggs, had made his stance clear. No vagrants, no eyesores, not on his parade route. The town had to look family-friendly, and Travis, wanting to keep his license and his good graces, had taken the words personally. He'd been simmering ever since. When a group of college students wandered in from the next town over, the noise level climbed. They were loud, careless, the kind of crowd that threw money around to look generous. One of them, half drunk, eyes glassy, said his tip jar had gone missing. He pointed toward the window where Danny's reflection had just passed. "Was that guy with the backpack here earlier?" the student asked. Travis didn't check the cameras, didn't ask questions. His jaw tightened. The frustration that had been building all week found an easy target. He shoved open the door, two regulars following, their laughter turning sharp in the cold air. Danny turned at the sound, not defensive, just startled. The first shove came quick, more reflex than thought. "Get off my property," Travis barked. Danny raised his hands, calm, tired. "I didn't take anything, sir." That might have been enough, if pride hadn't already replaced reason. Another man muttered something about cleaning up the block. Then the sound of boots scuffing on asphalt broke the night's rhythm. Across the street, Mia froze. She didn't hear words clearly, only tone, only impact. She lifted her phone instinctively, the lens shaking as it caught flashes of movement under the flickering streetlight. The crowd wasn't huge, but the noise was enough to make her heart pound. It wasn't the sound of danger, it was the sound of injustice. That ugly moment when power turns casual and cruelty becomes entertainment. Danny didn't fight back. Maybe it was training, maybe exhaustion. Maybe because he'd already learned that some battles you don't win with your fists. He stumbled back, caught himself, looked straight at Travis with something between sorrow and disbelief. That was the moment Mia's camera focused, a man who'd given years of his life to service, standing alone, surrounded by the same countrymen he once protected. Then, distant but growing, a siren cut through the night. The group scattered just enough to look like bystanders when the patrol car rolled in, its lights painting the street in red and blue. Travis stepped back inside, muttering something about troublemakers. Danny stayed where he was, breathing slow, eyes down. One of the officers asked if he wanted to file a report. He shook his head. He'd filed too many reports in his life that never led anywhere. When Mia stopped recording, her hands trembled. She didn't know why she had filmed it, instinct, maybe conscience, but she knew what she had captured wasn't a bar fight. It was something heavier, a snapshot of a town's silence breaking. As she looked across the street, Danny leaned against the lamppost, steadying himself, dignity bruised but still intact. Behind him, the sign in his bag slipped out and fell to the sidewalk. Hungry, not hopeless. Mia picked it up later that night. She wiped the dust off it and whispered, "Not anymore." That was the moment Clearbrook changed, though no one yet realized that the 30 seconds of video she uploaded would reach far beyond Main Street, stirring a storm that no one in that quiet town was ready for. The county hospital was quiet, except for the slow rhythm of monitors and the hum of fluorescent lights that never truly went dark. The night shift always carried a stillness that made people talk softer, as if sound itself could disturb the fragile dignity of pain. Daniel Rhodes lay on a narrow bed by the window, one arm bandaged, the other resting over a thin blanket. The bruises along his ribs ached with every breath, but it wasn't the physical pain that kept him awake. It was the silence, the kind that echoed after everything worth saying had already been ignored. Chief Anita Delgado stood at the foot of his bed, her uniform still creased from a long shift. She had that steady, practiced calm that comes from years of seeing both the worst and best in people. "You want to press charges?" she asked, her tone neutral, though her eyes carried a weight that betrayed sympathy. She'd already seen the footage. She knew what the right thing was, but she also knew the system rarely rewarded those who couldn't afford a lawyer or a headline. Danny didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the ceiling, counting the small brown stains above him, letting his mind drift to the simple breathing exercise his old VA counselor had once taught him. Inhale 4, hold 2, exhale 6. He had used that pattern in a sandstorm once, back in Helmand Province. It worked for fear, for pain, for waiting, but it didn't work as well for shame. "I slipped," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Anita frowned. "That's not what I saw on video." "I didn't see who it was," he replied, still staring upward. "Doesn't matter now." He meant it, at least partly. The truth was, pressing charges wouldn't erase the feeling of being treated like something disposable. He'd learned that lesson long before Clearbrook. In Afghanistan, he had seen good men, better men than himself, he often thought, do everything right and still never make it home. Back in the States, he'd worked 3 jobs, lived in a small apartment with peeling wallpaper, and thought he'd finally found stability until the night his building caught fire. The insurance company called it an act of God. Danny called it the last bad turn in a long list of them. He hadn't given up after that, not really. He just stopped waiting for anyone else to notice he was still trying. Anita hesitated, then sighed and jotted a note on her clipboard. "We'll keep the report open," she said, "just in case you change your mind." He nodded but didn't look at her. She paused at the door, wanting to say something that might mean something, something beyond procedure, but nothing fit. So she left him to the hum of the machines and the whisper of rain against the window. Across town, the world was waking up to a very different kind of noise. Mia Walker sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. Her phone buzzed every few seconds as notifications stacked up, retweets, comments, questions. The video she'd uploaded at midnight had already crossed 10,000 views. The caption she'd written from the heart, "This is Daniel Rhodes. He's a Marine. He fixes things. Last night, my town broke him," had become the match that lit the fuse. People were angry. Some were shocked. Others defended the bar, the town, the context. Mia read every word, her chest tightening. She hadn't meant to start a storm. She just wanted someone to care.
Now she was realizing that once you let truth into the world, you can't choose who picks it up or how they use it. She added another post, longer this time, a thread telling who Danny really was. She wrote about how he swept the sidewalks before dawn, how he refused tips, how he had once fixed her espresso machine with nothing but a screwdriver and patience. He never asked for anything, she typed, just a little space to exist. The thread spread like ripples from a stone. Some users asked for updates. Others dug through old photos, trying to find the man in uniform behind the man in the video. A few even shared stories of their own fathers, brothers, or uncles who had come home from service only to find the world quieter and colder than the one they left behind. At City Hall, Mayor Pro Tem Leonard Briggs scrolled through the headlines with the careful expression of a man who knows how to hide frustration behind professionalism. He had built his reputation on order, on keeping Clearbrook presentable for visitors and investors. He didn't see cruelty in the video. He saw disorder, disruption, the kind of viral story that made donors nervous. Within an hour, his staff issued a statement drafted in precise, cautious language. We condemn all isolated acts of violence and will continue to support our community through lawful measures of safety and decorum. But behind closed doors, Briggs was less diplomatic. We're not letting one drifter derail the festival, he told his aide. Clean streets mean a clean image. I don't want a single tent, a single sleeping bag, or another camera on Main Street. He called an emergency meeting for Monday to push through his latest piece of legislation, an anti-camping ordinance wrapped in the language of public safety, but designed for one thing: to make men like Daniel Rhodes disappear from sight. He justified it to himself easily. This wasn't cruelty, it was management. He told himself every town had to make hard choices. The truth, though, was simpler. Briggs feared bad publicity more than bad policy. And in his mind, both wore the same face: Danny's. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Danny drifted between half-sleep and memory. The antiseptic smell reminded him of field tents, of how he'd once promised Perez they'd both make it home. He thought about how strange it was to survive battle only to be broken by indifference. When the nurse came to check his vitals, she found him awake, eyes distant. "You should rest," she said gently. "I will," he replied, though he didn't. Through the narrow window, he could see the faint glow of the town beyond, the same town that had turned away, and, unknowingly, the same town that was about to be shaken awake. Because somewhere, on a dozen screens across the country, his story was already moving. And sometimes that's all it takes for the world to change. Not a speech, not a law, not a headline. Just 30 seconds of truth that refuses to stay quiet.
The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first wave of notifications began to ripple through timelines and message boards. What started as a shaky 30-second video from a sleepy Ohio town had already traveled farther than anyone in Clearbrook could imagine. It wasn't just a clip anymore. It was a symbol, a spark lit by a single act of courage and witnessed by millions who'd had enough of silence. By mid-morning, the video had left Clearbrook, crossed county lines, and landed in inboxes and group chats across the Midwest. A nurse in Dayton saw it during her coffee break and sent it to her neighbor, a retired trucker. He passed it to his brother, who rode with a veterans motorcycle club out of Columbus, the Iron Sentinels. By lunch, the clip had been pinned to 3 biker chat threads, shared in half a dozen veterans forums, and reposted by a handful of military pages under one caption: "We take care of our own." In a garage on the outskirts of Columbus, Jack Grizzly Malloy leaned over a workbench cluttered with wrenches, oil rags, and a half-finished carburetor rebuild. The morning light poured through the narrow windows, catching the thin silver streaks in his beard. His radio hummed low in the background, country static mixed with the faint whine of an air compressor. He wasn't looking for trouble that morning. He was fixing a friend's bike, same as any other Saturday.
But when his phone buzzed, he glanced at the screen, "You seen this?" and tapped the link. The video froze for a second on a thin, weary face, a man holding a sign that said, "Hungry, not hopeless." Then it played. The sound, the movement, the flash of indignity. By the end, Grizzly's jaw was tight, his hands still. He didn't know Daniel Rhodes, but he knew that look. The flinch of someone who's bracing for a hit that never should have come. He replayed the video twice. By the third time, he wasn't watching Danny anymore. He was seeing the system that let it happen, the neglect, the small-town fear of what doesn't fit neatly in a brochure. And the anger that rose in him wasn't wild or reckless. It was disciplined, the kind born from years of service and disappointment. He took a deep breath, wiped his hands, and reached for his phone. One called a Big Mike from the Cincinnati chapter, another to Ryder Joe out in Toledo. "Brothers," he said evenly, "we're going to Clearbrook. Peaceful, loud, visible. Helmets off, hearts on. They can't pretend they didn't see." Within an hour, chapter presidents from a 100-mile radius were on group calls, sending out ride maps and timestamps. No slogans, no politics, just a message. Show up for the man who stood alone. Back in Clearbrook, life looked deceptively normal. The weekend crowd filled diners and hardware stores, avoiding the topic that hung in the air like static. The mayor pro tem, Leonard Briggs, moved briskly through City Hall, drafting the final version of his ordinance, the so-called Downtown Beautification Bill, which aimed to maintain pedestrian safety and visual harmony. The language was tidy, the intent wasn't. He scheduled the vote for 6 p.m. Monday, confident it would pass quietly. Festivals brought donors, donors brought headlines, and headlines meant re-election. That was the arithmetic Briggs lived by. But he didn't know about the arithmetic forming beyond his reach, the kind that multiplied faster than any poll could measure. At Walker's Coffee Roastery, Mia printed signs on recycled cardstock. "Justice for Danny. Dignity is not a privilege." The hum of her old printer was the heartbeat of her determination. She had never been an activist. She wasn't even sure what organizing meant. But the messages in her inbox, from veterans, teachers, nurses, even bikers, told her something was moving, something big. She taped one sign to her shop window, stepped outside, and looked down Main Street. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Not a storm of destruction, but of awakening. Chief Anita Delgado sat in her office at the station, reviewing the Monday security brief. Her sergeant had already warned her about incoming visitors, and the dispatch logs confirmed it. Dozens of inquiries about road conditions, parking, and public assembly rules. She rubbed her temples and glanced at the photo on her desk. Her father, also a veteran, standing next to her at her academy graduation. She understood both sides, the order a city needed and the chaos it sometimes deserved to remember its conscience. She didn't want Clearbrook turning into a spectacle, but she also couldn't ignore what the town had done, and what it had failed to do. She called her deputy in. "We're doubling the day shift Monday," she said. "Traffic units at every main intersection. We reroute heavy flow from Main to Elm. No sirens unless it's an emergency. We keep things calm, respectful, visible." Her deputy hesitated. "You think this'll get out of hand?" "No," she said quietly. "I think it's already in hand, just not ours." By late Sunday, photos began circulating online. Bikes lined up outside diners, riders tightening gear straps, small-town residents waving as the convoys rolled past. No slogans, no shouting, just the steady hum of purpose. Someone had posted a message under one of the photos. Not a protest, a promise. That was what it became, a promise carried by rumbling engines and weathered hands, by men and women who understood what it meant to serve, to be forgotten, and to refuse invisibility. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel abstract. It sounded like steel and wind and the low roar of loyalty. And in the heart of Clearbrook, the town that had tried to keep quiet, something began to stir, the faint vibration of justice on its way. Monday was coming, and this time, no one would be able to say they didn't hear it.
By late afternoon, Clearbrook was no longer the quiet town it pretended to be. The air trembled with the low growl of engines carried from miles away, the kind of sound that made window panes hum and conversation pause mid-sentence. At 3:57 p.m., the first wave appeared over the ridge beyond Miller's feed store, a line of V-twin motorcycles cresting the hill like a procession. Chrome caught the sunlight in sharp flashes, and the steady rhythm of engines rolled down Main Street like distant thunder drawing closer. They came in rows, disciplined, deliberate. On their jackets were patches that told stories: USMC, 101st Airborne, Navy Dad, Gold Star Aunt, Widow's Ride. Some had names stitched beneath, reminders that service doesn't always end when deployment does. By 4:10, Main Street wasn't a road anymore. It was a river of engines, flags, and leather. 500 riders filled both lanes, then parked in near-perfect formation, their bikes standing like silent sentinels. People who had come to watch stood on sidewalks and rooftops, counting until numbers lost meaning. The sight alone carried the message: you can't ignore what's in front of you when it's this loud, this united, this human. At the front of the line, Jack Grizzly Malloy cut his engine. The rumble faded into a stillness so deep it almost rang. He stepped forward, bullhorn in hand, voice steady, the kind of voice that carries without shouting. "We're here for Daniel Rhodes," he began. His words weren't rehearsed, they didn't need to be. "We're here for every man and woman who comes home to paper walls, empty promises, and a country that forgets their names. We're not here to break things, we're here to fix what's broken." The crowd answered not with cheers, but silence, a silence heavy with respect. Behind him, flags moved slightly in the breeze. It felt less like a protest and more like a pledge. Inside Town Hall, the council chamber was standing room only. Every seat filled, every wall lined. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their cameras blinking red. The air was thick, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Mayor Pro Tem Leonard Briggs sat at the center of the dais, his suit pressed, his jaw tight. He shuffled papers more than necessary, not to read, but to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. The ordinance set on the agenda: an act to maintain public safety and aesthetic standards within the central business district. He thought the title sounded harmless, bureaucratic, but everyone in that room knew what it meant. When the time for public comment opened, the tension in the air stretched thin. One by one, residents stepped forward. Mia Walker stood first, holding her notes with trembling hands. "This town's beauty doesn't come from what we hide," she said. "It comes from what we choose to face." She read a list of small businesses that had quietly given Danny meals or work over the years. The baker who slipped him a loaf before closing. The auto shop that let him sleep near the bay doors in winter. Her voice cracked once, then steadied. Next came Mrs. Lang, a middle school teacher with gentle eyes. "My brother sleeps with the lights on," she said softly. "He hasn't seen combat in 15 years, but every night it comes back. You don't tell someone like that to disappear for the sake of appearances. You tell them they still belong here." Each speaker added a layer to the room's heartbeat, empathy mixing with anger, grief with resolve. The council's polished composure began to crumble beneath the collective weight of truth. Then, as the mayor prepared to close the floor, a figure stood up from the back row. The crowd turned. It was Travis Cole, the bar owner. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. He walked slowly to the microphone,
the sound of his boots echoing against the tile. "I was wrong," he said simply. The room went utterly still. He swallowed hard, knuckles white on the podium. "I did what I did because I was told to keep things tidy for the festival. Mr. Briggs told us to keep 'em out of sight this week, said it was bad for business." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I let that get in my head. I lost control. I'll be turning myself in after this." A murmur spread through the crowd, disbelief, then anger, then something like relief. The truth had cracked the room open. Briggs's face drained of color. "That's not," he began, but stopped when a reporter's phone buzzed, then another, and another. Screens lit up around the chamber. Mia's earlier public records request, the one she had filed on instinct the night of the attack, had just been answered. The local newspaper's website refreshed with the headline. Leaked emails show Briggs called homeless visual blight, urged merchants to discourage loiterers by any means necessary. The editor had hit public while the council was still in session. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more devastating. Briggs stared at the screen, his composure slipping as reporters raised their cameras. The sound of shutters and murmured questions filled the chamber like rainfall on glass. The council president whispered to a clerk. Papers were passed, heads nodded, motions made. At 7:12 p.m., the ordinance failed 5-2. The motion to suspend Briggs passed immediately after. Chief Anita Delgado, standing at the back of the room, stepped forward as the vote was finalized. She approached Travis calmly and said, "Let's go." Her tone was firm, but not cold. She turned to her sergeant and spoke clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We do this by the book." It wasn't just procedure. It was a statement to the town, to the council, to everyone watching, that law and decency were still capable of coexisting. Outside, word of the vote reached the bikers waiting in the square. The crowd parted as Grizzly walked to the steps, phone in hand. "It's done," he said. The line of riders exchanged glances, silent nods passing through like a current. Then, as if by instinct, they turned their keys. 500 engines roared to life in unison. The sound rolled through Clearbrook, down every street, past every storefront and open window. It wasn't a roar of rage, it was a salute, deep and resonant, a sound that made your chest vibrate and your heart lift. To some, it sounded like thunder. To others, like justice finally finding its voice. But to Daniel Rhodes, watching from a hospital window 2 miles away, it sounded like a promise kept. The sound rose, peaked, then slowly faded into evening, leaving behind something the town hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the shallow kind that comes from parades or banners, but the quiet pride that comes from standing up when it would have been easier to stay seated. For the first time, Clearbrook didn't look away. It looked forward.
When the roar of engines faded, Clearbrook didn't fall back into silence. It settled into something gentler. The kind of quiet that follows change. The kind that feels like dawn after a long storm. The national headlines lasted only a few days, but the echo stayed longer. People who had never looked twice at the corner of Main and Cedar now found themselves slowing down when they passed it. They weren't afraid anymore. They were curious. And little by little, that curiosity began to look a lot like care. Jack Grizzly Malloy and his crew didn't ride away after the cameras left. They stayed. Every month, their bikes would rumble once again through town, not as a protest this time, but as a promise kept. They teamed up with the church on Elm Street, a weathered brick building with a steeple that leaned slightly east from an old storm. Together, they started a monthly stand-down. Haircuts for veterans, hot meals served by volunteers, free medical checkups, and on-site VA representatives who refused to leave until every form was filled, every question answered, every man and woman seen. Grizzly called it Operation Belong.
When reporters asked him why he kept coming back, he said simply, "Because justice isn't a moment, it's maintenance." Word spread. Other clubs joined in, other towns took note. What began as outrage became organization. The noise of that day had turned into something quieter, the sound of people fixing what they'd broken. Meanwhile, Travis Cole closed Cole's Tap for a week. He covered the windows with brown paper, fixed the splintered door himself, and painted over the cracked frame. When he reopened, a handwritten sign hung inside the entryway. No more looking away. He took no shortcuts, no press interviews. He just worked. On the first morning back, Danny walked through the door carrying a toolbox, unsure whether to expect anger or forgiveness. Travis met him halfway, eyes tired but honest. "I've got an ice machine that won't quit rattling," Travis said quietly. "Think you can fix it?" Danny looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I can fix it." By noon, the clatter was gone. By evening, the jukebox played again. Songs older than both of them. Songs about mistakes and second chances. Travis paid him, refused to let him walk home in the rain, and added, "Come back tomorrow. The jukebox lights flicker when the bass hits." It wasn't friendship yet, but it was something like trust. Rebuilt the only way real trust ever is. Slowly, humbly, with action instead of words. Mia Walker's follow-up story didn't go viral, and she was fine with that. She titled it After the Noise. It wasn't about villains anymore. It was about patterns. How systems bend toward convenience, how empathy gets lost in paperwork, how a town can decide, consciously or not, who gets to be visible. She wrote about the bikers, about the church dinners, about the small things that didn't make front pages but made people's days easier. And she wrote about Danny, not as a victim, but as a man quietly rebuilding his place in the world. The hardware store owner, Mr. Blanchard, offered Danny a room above the shop. It wasn't much, a studio with one window, a cot, and the soft creak of floorboards that spoke when the wind blew. The first night, Danny spread his blanket on the floor. Beds felt unstable to him, like boats drifting too easily. But then he laughed at himself, a real full laugh that he hadn't heard in years, and climbed into bed anyway. The next morning, he woke up with sunlight on his face and the faint sound of birds outside the window. For the first time in a long time, he felt something simple, but solid, belonging. Every Sunday, Grizzly would stop by with his second helmet hanging loose on the handlebar. "Coffee run," he'd say. "You in?" Danny never said no. They'd ride out on Route 6, the morning air sharp and clean, steam rising from their coffee cups at the diner. Sometimes they talked about engines, about old missions, about nothing. Sometimes they didn't. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was easy, familiar. Locals got used to seeing them, the big man and the quiet mechanic, riding side by side down Main Street. Some waved, some just nodded. Either way, Clearbrook no longer saw a homeless vet. They saw Daniel Rhodes, a name, a person, a neighbor. When autumn returned and the Harvest Festival banners went up, there were still the usual arguments, budget cuts, permits, debates over which float should lead the parade. But under all that noise, something had shifted. The council approved a new addition to the town square, a simple bronze plaque mounted near the steps of Town Hall. It read, "For those we forgot to see, may we never again." On the morning of the dedication, Danny stood among the crowd, hands deep in his jacket pockets. Mia was there with her camera. Travis stood a few feet behind him, silent. Chief Delgado read a short speech about community, dignity, and duty, 3 words that had finally begun to mean something again. Afterward, when the crowd dispersed, Danny stepped forward and touched the plaque. The metal was cool against his palm. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He just stood there for a while, quietly, as though making peace with something invisible. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt seen, and that was enough. Clearbrook didn't become perfect. It still had bills, politics, disagreements, and tired mornings. But something inside it had changed direction, just enough to matter. People noticed the ones they used to overlook, and when someone stumbled, there was usually a hand to help them up instead of a whisper to push them aside. The town learned an old truth in a new way. You don't have to agree on everything to stand together when it counts. And those 500 engines, that single wave of noise that shook the dust off their conscience, had left behind the simplest civics lesson of all. When justice stops listening, you make enough sound to wake it up.